I was handed a very broad set of questions, so I've given a very, very broad set of answers. So the paper is pretty general, but let's get started. Okay, the first thing I need to state is something that I should not have to state at all and should be an obvious fact. Namely that the Soviet Union no longer exists. It has ceased to be. It has not been around for 22 years now. Its former satellite states have largely either gone capitalist or shrunk down to relatively irrelevant versions of their former selves. I shouldn't have to say this, but I do say it because listening to political chatter these days would not quite allow you to realize this. The specter of the Soviet Union still haunts us. The Fox News crowd still uses Soviet as a term of abuse for, well, anything, really. Leftists still passionately argue about Kronstadt, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the details of the Sino-Soviet split as if these things were still fresh news. And if you have been around much left conversation, you get this sort of deep sinking feeling in your stomach when you realize you're about to have this conversation. It seems as if the entire world is stuck in the past, and this is actually for very good reason. Those who were born after the Cold War, or even those who are around for it, have a hard time remembering just how important and just what a looming presence the Soviet Union was throughout the Western world. The Soviet Union always served as the great other. The entire identity of the West seemed to be formed in opposition to it. Whatever America was, whatever Europe was, it wasn't the Soviet Union. All other commitments came secondary. But this was all the more so for the left outside the Soviet Union. In a very real sense, it was our project, whether we wanted it to be or not. It was something that was being done in our name. Whether you got on that boat, when you got on that boat, and whether you got off of it was your defining feature as a leftist. Everything else was secondary. So leftists these days, it seems, must continue to pretend that the Soviet Union exists on pain of losing their identities. So what's the solution to this situation? Paradoxically, it's probably to talk about the Soviet Union more, so that's what But the focus here is supposed to be on lessons we can learn moving forwards. I'd like to focus on two lessons. The first lesson is that yes, indeed, everyone really is out to get you. This is not so much about the Soviet Union in itself, but about the relation to it had by the rest of the world. There's a very awkward sentence. It's really the reaction of the rest of the world to it. Almost as soon as the revolution occurred in the Soviet Union, they were invaded by agents of every major capitalist power, taxing its meager resources to the limit and forcing a retreat from some of their more socialist policies. After the Civil War, the major capitalist powers led by the US began a decades-long campaign of subversion against it and its allies. Agents were planted within the Soviet Union, and every time it seemed as if a communist-leaning party was going to come to power elsewhere, everything up to and including military force was used to stop this. I mean, if a communist party is about to come to power in Italy, you just kind of throw the election. If a communist party is going to come to power in South America, well, let the butchery begin. Eventually, the Soviet Union did collapse, but one must remember that this did not occur in a vacuum. The Soviet Union just didn't collapse of its own accord. It was, in a very real sense, on the losing side of a war. So the reaction that socialists can expect has two phases. First, the capitalist world will attempt to destroy you. And second, if they succeed, they will pretend that it was due to inherent flaws in your system, as opposed to their actual concrete attempts to destroy you. This pattern has been repeated again and again. We saw it with the coups against comparatively mild socialists such as Allende and, more recently, Chavez and Zelaya. We see it in the continuing economic warfare conducted against Cuba, to give just a couple of examples. Note that still every economic problem in Venezuela is attributed to Chavez's socialist policies, as opposed to, the fact that developing countries generally tend to have economic problems. Note that even more absurdly, Cuba's difficulties are attributed to socialism, full stop. Again, ignoring the rather hard to ignore embargo. There's an even more troubling aspect to this problem. When the entire world is literally against you, the natural reaction is to create a security state with, let us say, authoritarian tendencies. We must remember that Lenin, at least in his early days, sincerely wanted to create some sort of Soviet-based democracy. This, however, ended up being, let's say, scaled back tremendously. First as they entered the Civil War, and then as they entered the subversion attempts by the Western world. We see this again in Cuba. Castro always maintained that he could not hold elections, because if he were to do so, the United States would throw them. Which may have sounded like a thin excuse to some until the CIA documents came out and it turned out that he really didn't intend to throw the elections as soon as they happened. So, if you want to have a socialist country, you will practically be forced to become authoritarian, and then of course propagandists will claim that your socialism is inherently authoritarian. This is a serious and pressing problem for any leftist adverse to authoritarianism. I have no answer to this problem, but we should be discussing it a lot more as we think of ways to move forward. So, that's lesson 1. Lesson 2. Turns out the Soviet Union actually worked pretty well. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Soviet Union is remembered. It occupies a place in people's minds as an equal and opposite rival to the United States. This is in itself a great accomplishment. It is worth remembering that the Soviet Union was actually, for most of its history, a developing nation. What did this relatively small economy do with what it had? Well, a lot of things happened in the Soviet Union, but if we can generalize, they managed to pretty much guarantee food, housing, healthcare, and employment to pretty much their entire population for most of their history. The very things the far more developed capitalist economy of the US still cannot do to this day, probably structurally. They further did this with a largely planned economy. The Soviet planning bureaucracy was, of course, far from perfect. It was Byzantine, it was plagued with corruption. However, even with these imperfections, they were able to sustain a rate of growth comparable to major capitalist powers throughout its history, and well exceeding these in their early years. Further, according to standard measures of efficiency used in capitalist economics, the Soviet economy turned out to be just as efficient as the US, plus or minus a couple points. This news actually came as a blow to both sides, as each side was convinced of the immense superiority of their system. I say, well, it's a good baseline. And this, of course, raises the question of what could be accomplished with a developed economy and a more efficient planning bureaucracy. It is capitalism's great shame that we cannot yet match the achievements of a country from the last century that started literally with dirt. That is lesson 2. There is one more thing I'm supposed to address in this, and this is the question of whether the Soviet Union is authentically socialist. The question of whether the Soviet Union was really socialist, whatever that means, is not only divisive, it is actually boring. Debates around this topic hinge on cherry-picking a definition of socialism from somewhere. Oh, and there are plenty on offer, right? Communism is the abolition of private property. Socialism is the living creativity of the masses. Pick one. And then engaging in the sort of argument that is more reminiscent of those fictional medieval theologians who argued about angels on the head of a pin than it is about anything useful. It's more theology than politics. And really what this is usually about is signaling what kind of leftist you are, and not about any substantive political commitments you have. The Soviet Union, furthermore, was a huge, complex beast that had a very long history. really, anybody who wants to comb through this can find enough examples to prove whatever their desired conclusion is. There was not one Soviet Union, there were many, often at the same time. A far better approach, I believe, is to recognize that the Union was the product of people earnestly trying to build socialism, while faced with limited choices and incomplete information. The question ought to be not whether it was socialist, whatever you choose to mean by that, but how we can improve on the first draft they provided us and ask which features of their assorted models, if any, are worth carrying forward. But that would take a longer and less general presentation. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up.